I'm going to ask the members of the panel to why don't you come up and get yourselves comfortable while I'm introducing you. One little other announcement. The net metering task force is meeting here in the amphitheater on Thursday from 9 to 12, and everyone is invited, not just the task force members, but everyone is invited to that. So thank you. As Jennifer mentioned, what we're here to talk about is sort of the biggest transformation that's going to be happening to the grid. Our built environment depends entirely on the grid right now, but what's becoming very obvious is that that's not going to be true for very much longer. And what this panel is going to talk about is what that means on the ground. But before we do that, why don't I give you some facts about what's going on with the grid right now. The economics are there right now. It's now cheaper in Hawaii to do solar plus storage than to take your power from the grid, and that's a really big thing that's going on in the industry. NextEra, which is the country's largest renewables developer and owner, just announced that it was buying Hawaiian Electric. So the utilities are changing their business model because of the economics that's going on. One second. The technology is also getting there. We all know what's going on with the Teslas and so forth in this country. Ambri, which is our homegrown, anybody here from Ambri? Ambri is our homegrown storage company here in Massachusetts. They just announced that they're going to be building a standalone grid for Joint Base Cape Cod that's going to be a combination of renewables and storage. And just to put that in context, Joint Base Cape Cod, if it were a city in Massachusetts, would be our 7th largest city after Worcester. So that's a big grid, and that is going to be a self-contained standalone grid. So the technology is there, the economics are there. And finally, the regulatory and market structure is there. We've got a lot of PUCs that are announcing, as Massachusetts did recently, this grid modernization docket that they've opened that's going to transform the pricing to go along with that. New York State is doing something similar. I'm sure that we'll hear from the panel about other states where the regulatory and market structure is likewise being changed. So the economics are there, the technology is there, and the regulatory and market structure is there. So this is happening right now. The Rocky Mountain Institute came out with a study that I know a lot of people have seen recently that made it very obvious that this change is happening a lot faster than we thought that it was going to change. So that's why we had this panel, is these guys are going to tell us about what that means on the ground. How is the utility paradigm going to change? There are huge opportunities out there, enormous explosion in technology and business opportunities that's going to take place because of this change. And that's why we're going to talk to these guys about it, because they're all the experts in this. So let me introduce our panel. Karl, is it Rabago? Rabago. Karl Rabago is the executive director at the Pace Law School Center for Energy and the Environment. And he is a passionate advocate for clean energy. He's got a background that really spans the private sector, government service, and he was a Texas Utility Commissioner and has also served as a director at the Rocky Mountain Institute and a lot of other things. In the past, Ron Binns, who I just saw for the first time in 20 years this morning, is a utility policy consultant. He was the chair of the Colorado Utility Commission, and he also was a consumer advocate in Colorado. Is that not true? Yep. Also a tireless advocate for the transition to clean energy, and he's going to tell us about that side of things. Nathan Adams has generously offered to stand in for Mary Powell, the CEO of Green Mountain Power, and we all wish her a speedy recovery. As you'll hear under Mary's leadership, Green Mountain Power has transformed itself into arguably the most clean energy friendly utility in the nation. They really are changing their business model in the way that we really expect those business models to be changed in the future for all utilities. So with that, I think I'm going to sort of launch into our first, let me grab my stuff here. Our first questions for the panel here. And I think I'm going to start with you, Ron. The utilities are really facing a very risky and uncertain time. They're going to have to make a lot of changes to the way they've done things, really for the history of the industry. And I think we should start with, how do you think the role of the distribution utilities is going to change?
Thanks, Carter, and it is nice to see you after 20 years. You've barely aged, and
God bless you.
that's more than I can say about most of the people in this room. I understand Nessie is getting grayer as the years go on. However, there's hope. I know you've got an infusion of new people. Congratulations to the organization. I understand this is your 40th annual meeting of the sort, and I'm greatly honored to have been asked to speak. Thank you. I do a lot of work in what's generally called the utility business model and in the regulatory model. And as an answer to your question in part, Carter, I want to talk about Hawaii. 107 inches of snow this winter probably gives you all a pretty good reason to move to Hawaii. There's actually another good reason to move to Hawaii. The utility, not the environmentalists, the utility in Hawaii is planning, this is in black and white, in ink, to move to a 67% solar system by 2030. Yeah, quite remarkable. Now, the reason they're doing that actually is not, well, who knows? There's a lot of reasons. But it turns out it's cheaper. That's the most amazing part. Hawaii generates most of its electricity from oil generation. They're captive of the international oil price roller coaster. So right now, prices are pretty good in Hawaii. Relatively, the electricity price is probably down to 25 cents a kilowatt hour. That's down from 36 or 37 cents when oil prices were higher. So there's certainly a price advantage, but what's most interesting to me in that story, here's a bona fide electric utility, HECO, being bought by another bona fide energy company, NextEra, and they're all doing that with eyes wide open that they can get to a significantly renewable energy grid with, you've probably heard this before, the sun doesn't shine all the time. The wind doesn't blow all the time. In fact, they and other utilities have figured out that it is possible to run a system with substantial penetration of renewable energy, and we're seeing it in Hawaii first of all. I want to mention one other place in the country, which, well, I shall mention two, Massachusetts, who's done some remarkable work at the Public Service Commission level, the Energy Board here, and also New York, who's got a proceeding called the Reinventing the Electricity Energy Vision, the REV process. All of those are dedicated, all of these, I mean Hawaii, Massachusetts, soon to be many other states, New York, they're understanding that we really have to reinvent the role of the utility. We have to reinvent how we look at energy. Now, as I try to decide what would be useful to the people in this room, as I get a turn at the mic, I want to turn some of these kind of ethereal concepts into what it's going to mean for your business. Many of you are in energy efficiency. You've labored in the vineyards of energy efficiency for many years. It's been a difficult slog. Nobody at the utility or the regulatory agency seems to appreciate fully what you do and what you can do. You're kind of a stepchild of the regulatory process. They have to invent little incentive mechanisms for you to hang on to life. You know what I'm talking about. I think salvation is near. I'm going to talk a little bit later about new approaches that I am advocating regulators take, and regulators are beginning to wake up to the fact that we sooner than later need to begin compensating for utilities for what we want them to do, not for what they're naturally cut out to do, but for what we want them to achieve. And a much more efficient use of energy, which is where you come in, is the major feature of that. So, Carter, I've droned on for a while. I'll stop now. I'm not sure I even answered your question, but c'est la vie. You can try it again if you want to.
Thanks, Ron. It is a lot like, when you think about it, what we went through with telecom. I mean, Verizon looks entirely different company than NYNEX did, 20 years ago. And so I want to ask.
Don't forget New York Tel before there was NYNEX.
That's right. That's right. It's all happened very quickly in telecom, and I think that we're kind of looking at the same thing. So that's we'll go to Nathan. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention Nathan is the VP of Business Development for Green Mountain Power. And Nathan, your company has taken some very unusual steps in response to the changing utility landscape. And specifically, you focused on clean energy products and services. Could you talk a little bit about why you and your colleagues see those changes as being important to your ratepayers and to your investors, your stakeholders in your company?
Yeah, I mean, so for the first thing I would say is we call them customers, not ratepayers. But I have never in my life understood the use of that term in the utility industry. But,
awesome.
So, why have we? I think it starts with the fact that GMP looks at all this disruption as a positive thing for the industry and not something to defend against. For us, it's an opportunity to leverage new technology, to offer up a business model that delivers and generates electricity more efficiently and more cleanly. So for us, as we've pushed our business model further down towards, no less so about delivering a commodity and more so about delivering a service, for us it's about that evolution, right? So we're starting now with financing clean energy equipment for our customers. We're doing a whole home energy efficiency retrofit project, a product for that actually. And it's really about the movement from, again, I think it's where this industry has to go. You have a state of affairs where this industry was built on continuing growth in economies of scale, right? It was, electricity use is going to rise by 5% a year infinitely, and that's not happening anymore. We're looking at a future where growth rates could be flat or even negative. And so you have to rethink how you deliver that model. And for us, it's about taking a turn. Instead of going from the commodity delivery, it's about offering energy as a service. And I think that's the direction we want to go.
Let me press on that just a little bit, though. I mean, what is it, turning around a corporation that's a successful corporation that's doing business perfectly well, what's driving that? What was it that made you jump up one day and say, we got to change everything we do? I mean, what drives that? What is the opportunity you see?
Yeah, there's a couple. Depends on who you ask. I mean, some people will say that it's the realization that it's changing regardless. So you better get moving and change it for you. And some think of it as sort of like, hey, technology has given us an opportunity here to change. I like it as the latter. If you look at the management of GMP is sort of a self-loathing group, and we don't. We try in every way possible to be the anti-utility. So whenever a decision is made, it's well, what would a utility do, and should we just do the opposite? So
Do you rap?
in my younger years, I did. I won't do it publicly. But I can't remember what I was answering. Did I answer your question?
What was your
I see
sort
a
of
theme developing here.
What was your like, okay, we're going to change course here. What was driving that? What were, the things that really made you do that?
I think it was really just, that company has an incredible impatience, an incredible sense of urgency, and just, when I joined there a year ago with a really strong desire to uproot the utility model and completely change it. And I can't really sort of point to one thing. It's like the leadership has this burning desire to make this change, and they see the opportunity.
Great, thank you. Oh. So, Karl, it's your turn. A lot of our audience here are architects, builders, engineers, people who really interact with the grid every day in making their choices about what they're going to build and what they're going to do. And can you talk a little bit about how buildings and campuses, just look into the future for us, and how are buildings and campuses and users of the grid, are they going to, how are they going to interact in the future when we have this new business model?
Yeah, good question, and it's not that far in the future, right? Obviously there's some people trying to do it right now. When we were getting ready for this, I was thinking back to a conversation I had with one of my little brothers, 3 years younger than me. One of his high school buddies, Rob, and I met him when I got out of the Army, and I was about to go to the commission in Texas. And he took a job as an architect. He went to school to become an architect, and he went to work for a production builder whose name shall remain nameless right now. But I said, Rob, I've just been finding out about all this energy efficiency stuff, and are you incorporating that in your designs as a new graduate, of architecture school, now working at one of these big builders? And he said, nah, not so much. He said, he says, there's more value in building a niche for vases and artwork in the house than there is in adding insulation. And he was right. From an economic and business perspective, it made no sense to waste your time trying to figure out how to make that house more energy efficient, passively, actively, to change the components. It made more sense to put in that little niche thing that somebody could put their vase in, and then it would look really pretty. And it would grab and sell the house when somebody walked in. That's a legacy of the old system, right? Good reasons. Last century. We're old enough to talk about last century. And it's changed. We've gone toward, you mentioned the telephone industry, we've gone to this network systems view of how the electric system works. A whole lot of people have found themselves impatient with the idea that the only choice at the electricity store is going to be, the joke used to be black and rotary dial, I think of the sort of tomatoes, these pasty pink flavorless things that are pretty affordable, but that's just all that's available. And they've been reading about how you might be able to grow your own and how you might get better nutrition and better health for your family if you do some of that stuff. This stuff is happening, technology enabled, customer preference enabled, big problem drivers like environment and climate change enabled and inspired, and the system is getting exciting at the small end. And under the rules of network economies, that means there's value to be mined. We don't have to just pay a subsidy for somebody to go after it, but we can actually create a business proposition around somebody getting it. So what does this mean to you if you're in the building space? Is that you've got an opportunity to extract additional value from the building. You've got an opportunity to participate in brand new business models that reverse the old system on its head, and that you are going to be increasingly held accountable for helping your customers live or work in buildings that in fact give them an engagement upside working with the utility. Easier today with GMP, soon with every utility out there. So how do you turn that unused real estate on the roof into a generator? How do you turn that extra space in the utility closet into, with a little bit of information technology and management control, into something that allows them to participate in increasingly lucrative demand response markets? How do you add insulation and passive energy stuff in a way that you can tap into this value-based distributed end of the system market? That's what I think it means to you, and increasingly means to you. You will be active managers and builders and developers of an actively managed part of the system. That's pretty cool.
There are going to be a lot of changes to, the way we do things. I was at a conference the other day where a guy likened what we're going through to the invention of refrigeration. Because it's going to completely revolutionize the supply chain for those products and services. So what are some of the crazy, changes in the supply chain that you've heard about that might be coming down the pike? Just how is that going to change the way the entire delivery of these services for us consumers?
Well, that's a odd question, but
Sorry.
no, I think I'm up. I'm gonna try and pretend to answer that. Well, I say no, but seriously, one of my clients is an entity called Steffes Corporation, Steffes. They make hot water heaters and control systems for hot water heaters. They're working in Hawaii, as it turns out, but that's only incidental. They're working to sell utilities on the product, which is a thermal storage for the electric grid based on networked water heaters. So wire up a bunch of water heaters. Think of them as one large tank. Just aggregate them all mentally into one large tank. And during the day, that tank can either require heating, which draws electricity, or back off, which gives net electricity back to the grid. Now that is in the business, as you all know, it's called a regulation service. So Steffes is banking on the fact that utilities will be very interested in using an instantaneous demand of a grid of networked hot water heaters as regulation service. Now, let your mind go and start thinking of other things that might provide the same service. Your refrigerator freezer makes ice on its own schedule. And when it makes ice, it has a spike in electricity demand. Why let that refrigerator act randomly on the grid when, if it communicated to the grid, it could be scheduled? Move it by 5 minutes, that's all it requires perhaps, or something like that. Do the same. I've mentioned hot water heaters. You probably aren't thinking about your air conditioning units this week, but air conditioning control in Denver, Colorado is a huge resource for demand response for the electric utility. Keep thinking of those kinds of applications, and if you imagine what I think the grid will look like eventually, the so-called Internet of Things, where everything connected to the electric grid is also connected to the IT infrastructure. It's the internet coming to electricity. All devices are going to be visible to the grid, and in a very organic way, without you knowing, without users typically knowing what's going on, that grid can be managed to provide the optimal resource for everybody. I mean, you don't know, you don't care about how backbone internet providers balance the internet. Well, in a similar way, you will be at a point where you won't know and you won't care. All you want is ice, right? That's all you really want out of the deal. All you want is hot water when you want it. You don't need to know what the backstage operations look like. And that's what an intelligent grid is going to look like. So that's my shorthand version of the intelligent grid.
So I can speak from sort of real world example. This this summer, we will have installed our first version of what Ron talks about on a single circuit in Rutland, Vermont, which is a small little city, about 15,000 people. We consider it our petri dish for experimentation. And what we've done on that
Do
single
the customers know that?
No, they sort of appreciate it, I think, but it's in a very good way. So what we're doing on this circuit will be a product of dynamically connecting not only grid-based assets like several solar installations, a grid-based battery system, but also as much customer behind-the-meter storage as we can find. And what Ron was talking about is people don't realize this, but behind the meter in the customer's home and the customer's business sits an enormous resource in the form of what I call latent storage, right? A water heater is stored energy. The building envelope is stored energy. Commercial freezers, chillers, all those things represent stored energy. An electric vehicle, everything there is a resource that has value, and we need to be able to connect it to the grid to realize that value. This summer, we're going to be connecting up about 200 residential water heaters. Today, they are controlled in a very dumb way. Every day, right now, we have a program where we shut these water heaters off for 4 hours straight. And you can imagine what that feels like to the customer who may or may not have hot water at the end of 4 hours. So we're installing...
Well, if you're in a petri dish, it doesn't matter, right? So what we're doing is installing dynamic controllers on those water heaters. And instead of a 4-hour shutoff, they'll probably shut off for the 1 hour where it really matters in a sort of a portfolio format. For this audience, my ask actually is that you think about what you can do to capture those valuable end uses and how we can cost effectively link them up to our controls format. I spend enormous amounts of energy. My team spends enormous amount of time trying to figure out how we get that last 100 yards done, because the control systems for these end uses are incredibly expensive. You know, you can look at controls that are the cost of the water heater itself. So I'm begging of you, somebody please invent the $20 end-use control, and I'll be so much happier.
I'll add a couple of things, just sort of some examples about how things are going to change. Here's one example. I think the value proposition will change. When I arrived at Austin Energy, I asked the staff if they would plot a carbon duration curve. It was 2008-9. We thought, hey, we're going to get carbon requirements, and we're going to end up having to carbon tune our energy efficiency programs and our other interactions with customers to maximize the carbon value. And everybody always talks about plotting a load duration curve, and everybody knows that, it peaks at 4 p.m. on a summer day or whatever it is. But I wanted to know what the carbon duration curve looked like. And it turns out it was pretty interesting. There's a little peak at 10 a.m. when the gas plants start up and they're cold, and so their emissions rates are higher. Then as the day warms up, the emissions per kilowatt hour go down because you're adding gas to a coal-heavy base, so you're actually cleaner per unit of energy during the peakiest times of the day. And then, of course, at night, your carbon intensity is really, really high if you're running coal as base load. So just putting that on the table got us thinking about what our energy efficiency programs were. First of all, that 10 a.m. peak when the gas plant started had us reorient our electric vehicle charging program to emphasize workplace charging so that we could end up with V2Grid systems that would tap into fully charged batteries. They arrive at 8, they top off. We'll pull them down at 10 to ease the ramp on the gas plants. The reduced wear and tear on the gas plants pays for all of that, because that's expensive infrastructure that actually wears out faster when you ask it to start in 15 minutes. And if you're going for highest carbon per buck, carbon per dollar spent, running a program to cycle refrigerators at night when people don't open them is a good way to guarantee carbon reductions that we'd never pursue if we were just pursuing on-peak load duration curve type values. So there was a carbon value in actually getting that load control technology. So That's one example, right? I'll give you another one. I think Ron said something about, well, utilities are doing. One of the things we're exploring in New York especially is that maybe it's not the utility. This platform provider thing that the utility might take on the role of means that somebody else could do this function of pulling together the customers, and third parties would be in charge of it. And they would form coalitions of these demand response functions or these technology deployment functions. And that leads to the third example. I've been asking myself a lot lately, why does the utility actually have to control the meter? And we act as if that's, of course, the ultimate thing. The utility has to control the meter. But I got a revenue grade to meter in my Coulomb charger for my Volt. A lot of inverters have revenue grade. And as Nest is showing us, the really interesting thing is an open API cloud-based enterprise bus from the utility, not a physical infrastructure connection down at the meter. We just have to do value transactions in the cloud, as Ron was just saying. So why not maybe encourage the provision of value chains in which I say, for example, develop a community solar project and I deploy real smart metering technology and Nest and home network systems to the customer members so they can optimize the value they get from their community solar project and more effectively manage their electricity at home. And what does the utility have to do? Well, they have to post a short, mid, and long-term marginal capacity and energy price for every 8,760 hours a year so those third parties can figure out where the value is. So lots of changes and opportunities in both the supply chain and the value chain. Don't automatically assume you're just going to be answering an RFP from the utility.
I'm going to follow up on this because you've both mentioned this idea now of having some other sort of source of some other relationship with the customer for the utility. And I have commercial clients, manufacturing plants, and so forth. One of the things that's always struck me is how little the utility knows about what's going on the other side of the meter. They don't know what's hooked up to that stuff. They don't know what's creating that load for them. And so I want to ask a slightly different question, which is all the people that are out here are likely to be the ones who are going to be having a different relationship with the utility. They may be those third parties. They may be that open platform. They may be the apps that are interacting with the utility. How is their relationship with the utility going to change as a service provider as they, get behind the meter for the utility?
We're dealing with it in two phases. First is the transition phase, right? And then there's the ultimate reality phase. Right now, a whole lot of utilities don't know how to perform as a neutral, objective, value-focused platform provider. They haven't practiced the skill. They've had a different set of disciplines, incentives, and rewards. And we're having conversations about how we want them to do it, but if, like, for example, some people proposing some pretty draconian rules. They shall not be allowed to own any distributed generation or to operate any of these programs themselves. They're not allowed to do them as vendors. They must have straight up third party things because we're scared of the market power they'll exercise. Well, we could go too far, off the deep end there because we also expect the utilities who are in the process of transforming to maintain reliability, to serve as an introductory conduit for new technology, to prove the efficacy of the ideas that people want to talk out. A lot of conversation right now is about whether the distribution platform provider is going to be independent, like our independent system operators are for the transmission system. I think it's going to be a combination of both.
You want to go next, or? Okay. First, my client in Hawaii is an entity called the Blue Planet Foundation. It's a environmental group. They push clean energy, but they have a pretty broad vision of what consumer engagement should be, what consumer rights should be. And On their behalf, I am proposing a new regulatory scheme in Hawaii based on the so-called RIO, R-I-I-O system used in the UK, but Americanized. I'm getting to my point. Hang in there. What RIO does is it rewards utilities for desired outputs that the regulator, that society wants them to achieve. That's what I said. It seems pretty obvious that regulation ought to be tuned to reward utilities for what we want them to do. That's not what we do. We pay utilities right now on the basis of how much they invest. A system which worked pretty well for 60 years or so, but it's now really ragged. So what are we proposing in Hawaii? We're proposing a system of rewards and some penalties, but mostly rewards for achieving certain things. And here's my point. One of the measures is what we're calling interconnection quality. We want to know, how is the utility performing in dealing with I'll call them, all of you, third-party providers, interconnecting with the grid. Did they follow their tariffs when they made you an offer? Did they respond to you? Did they show up? Did your interconnection go well? It's going to be kind of a popularity contest among those who rely on the utilities grid for what they do. And that will include energy efficiency providers, ESCOs, and so forth. Now, we're going to make that valuable enough to the utility, that particular grade, we're going to make that valuable enough to the utility that it shows up in their earnings per share if they do well or don't do well on that score. That's one little aspect of what I think we have to begin doing as a democracy, and that is rewarding utilities for what we want them to do. That's a completely different approach than allowing them to, quote, recover their costs, which is all we do right now. So we've left a lot on the table with how we regulate. So I think the utilities will be the grid operators for the foreseeable future. I know there's calls out there, John Wellinghoff being one of them, that we should adopt an independent entity to run the grid. That has its attractions, but it also has its downsides. I think where we start right now is making it clear to the Green Mountain Powers of the world, although I think it is already clear to GMP, but we need to make it clear to the utilities, look, this is the new regime. Not only are we going to require you to do this, we're going to reward you for doing this well. If we get to that point, the rest is going to take care of itself. I'm actually not concerned about that at all.
So I guess my response to current interaction to sort of more like the same way you interact with the local DMV, right? It's which is depressing, I know, but you know, you're sort of applying for rebates and things like that, and it's a bunch of paperwork and policy and da 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 da. Where I'd ultimately like to see it go, where my vision would take us is it's more like the way you interact with eBay or Amazon. And which is to say that I don't, like what Ron just said, I think the current and historical utility compensation model is the most ghastly economic entity I've ever witnessed. There's no other business in the world that, the first part of my career I spent, in competitive companies doing everything I could, clawing and scraping to get capital. And then you go to utility and they're handing it out like it's free lunch. So that has to change, and what I don't know how to do this yet, but as an economist at heart, what I want to see is as much as possible subject to market forces. So I don't like it when policymakers dictate prices. What I want to see is a robust and liquid market for the services you can offer, that you can see transparently, that you'll be interacting with like a broker or a trader or somebody looking at eBay. And the whole thing becomes much more, it becomes the incentives then, the market produces incentives for both sides that bring about efficiencies.
I want to add, I think this shift from this prescriptive regulatory model to the performance thing is absolutely critical. And in the building sector, you guys need to understand this, and you already do, I think. as well. In our green building group at Austin Energy, Richard Morgan and I had this conversation like 100 times. We wanted to get to the zero energy capable home standard, and we just could not imagine a way to do that with a prescriptive model for every single possible measure and technology that could go into a home or a building, and try to figure out what exactly that standard would be. We knew we had to go to a performance model for setting the green building standard. We knew the energy, standard for the building code. We knew we'd have to typify the cohort of residential buildings, single family brick, 2-story stucco, whatever it is, and figure out what the performance standard would be. It would give the builders and the remodelers a lot more options, a lot more control, and a lot more responsibility. And if you imagine that happening with the utilities as well, you can imagine a much richer, an exponentially richer opportunity to interact with the utility.
I want to take this opportunity to remind you all of something. In the headlines, you'll read about the EPA's Clean Power Plan, all the debate about this. One thing you need to know is that the EPA's vision, and it's a correct one, is that one of the main channels of compliance the utilities can take to reduce carbon emissions is energy efficiency. You're going to be, I know Massachusetts is not the choir that I should be preaching to, not in Massachusetts. But the utilities are suddenly going to begin to see energy efficiency in a different light. It will become the cheapest way they can comply with new air quality regulation. That's a big change. That's what's on the table when these regional debates, these political kerfuffles over what the EPA is doing, the war on coal, all of that rhetoric, when you get down to it, means that we are for the first time going to begin to curtail, put a cost on using the environment as a dumping ground for carbon dioxide, something we've done with impunity. So when you start adding that carbon value to the energy that you save when you do retrofits, that's going to boost the value proposition for what you do. It's going to come in slowly and it's going to accelerate, but that's going to be a very real and palpable change in the next few years that you should expect. You will find utilities across this country, dare we say, even in the southeast, who will suddenly want to have energy efficiency programs because it's the cheapest way to do it.
Thanks. That's actually a great segue into my next question. I just did this panel out at UMass in the beautiful Pioneer Valley. Woo! It was a bunch of science faculty and science students. And we were talking about this same issue. And the students were all like, cool. And the faculty were all like, whoa. So let's talk a little bit about the whoa part. All of those things that we load onto utilities, all the things that we have been very used to getting from utilities without even knowing it. I'm talking about reliability. I'm also talking about things like grid investment. And also we have found it very, the easiest way to do environmental policy has been through the utilities. So those are some big things that we have done through the traditional utility. How is that going to change once we start busting up this whole business model for utilities?
Yeah, utility.
Yeah, what are you going to do?
Well, boy, that's a big one. That wasn't on your list of prepared questions. So a couple of those things, let's just sort of, when handed a giant question, let's break it down into smaller questions. I think the big one probably is the reliability component of that, right? I mean, you have, at the end of the day, the way I like to say it is that we're, in America, we like our beer cold, our cars fast, and our power on. And nobody most people don't care at all what's happening behind that light switch. And so they just want it to be on. There's two times you care about electricity. One is when you get the bill, and two, when it goes off. And so for us, it's that question of reliability as you get, as you see a higher penetration of DG, a more complex responsive system, you have to begin to look at new solutions to problems. And the best example I have is working with our distribution engineering team, who historically have looked at, these are the folks who engineer the grid, and they know what to put where and where a new substation goes, et cetera. And they have a set of tools they've always used. Bigger lines, bigger poles, new substations, and other things, right? Well, technology is giving us a new set of power electronics tools. Storage is a great example, right? And getting this into their lexicon, into their tool belts, is a big step for us. And so now we're starting to see, how do we approach these reliability issues, these pending reliability issues, with a new set of tools? When you start to put a lot of solar on a distribution circuit, you get some unintended consequences, things like what's called flicker, which is when you have big, decently sized solar panels on a circuit. If a cloud cover goes over, that solar ramps down, then up, and it causes voltage flicker on the circuit. So how do you deal with that? Well, you look at your new tool sets, and you think about ways to operate that grid, particularly using the customer. Again, I'll say this over and over again. How can we use customers' equipment behind the meter to help solve these problems in ways that the customer never sees a negative impact? I don't know if that answered part of it.
We also have to sort of manage expectations, right? That kid in the audience, if the Wi-Fi doesn't work at the Starbucks, he goes to the Dunkin' Donuts. If that doesn't work, he turns on the personal hotspot on his cell phone, and he's got Wi-Fi on his iPad, and by the way, Dad gets the bill, right? Electricity is not quite that same thing. So you do have to kind of keep it at the high level and ask yourself, look, electricity has components of public goods and private goods. Right? Now, the first thing you have to ask is, do you believe your rhetoric? And the rhetoric in this country is supposed to be that if it can be privately provided, that's what we're supposed to try to do. But on the other hand, the public goods components are too important to leave to the vagaries of the market, and whether or not Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks will keep their Wi-Fi up, right? So what we did with telecom in the early days, and I think is sort of available for us today, is to look in a more granular fashion at what that electric service thing is, and ask if some components of that can be provided competitively with the risk that the providers might not make it, or they might leave the scene or go bankrupt, but that it doesn't bring down the entire grid. And what are the things that we can't risk putting over there in that private sector, or in which the incremental benefits from innovation are not great enough to take that risk? That, in the end, means that regulators have a job to do. And Ron and I are in perfect position, having both being former regulators. We are perfectly suited to opine on what current regulators should do. And I often say they need to cape up and step up to these issues and do the tough regulatory work of figuring out where can competition and performance-based regulation and ideas like that improve the performance and the choices that we have without compromising it. Nobody said it'd be easy, but God, you know how much those guys get paid? It's hardly anything, actually. So. But it builds a great career.
You're going to hear a lot about grid reliability in these months of debate about the Clean Power Plan of the EPA.
It's the last refuge of electric scoundrels.
Exactly right. Most of that rhetoric is by people who have no idea what they're talking about. Okay? Grid reliability is not negotiable. It's not going to be affected by whatever eventual rules are determined. It's the sort of, the standard is the how many babies can you drop in a hospital standard, okay? None, okay? No reliability changes because of the Clean Power Plan. Gina McCarthy knows this. She's been defending it, but she has to put up with, frankly, some pretty insulting arguments from state legislators and others who don't know what they're talking about. It's a Trojan horse kind of argument. Now, I speak from some experience. Also, like Karl, I'm a former regulator, sort of like a former smoker. I know the evils of my past ways. But when I was a regulator, one thing we did in Colorado is we made a big transition from coal to gas. Not completely by any means, we made a big move. It wasn't driven by climate, it was driven by regular pollutants, NOx and SOx and things like that. Xcel moved downward in their carbon emissions 27% in 8 years by switching fuels. They did it in a very careful fashion. We looked at every single plant that was affected. We did power modeling studies of where the flows were going to be, and it was successful. Now, it took some attention, and it took the work of a lot of engineers to get it right. But Xcel's got at least as resilient a system they ever did, and we went through in 8 years approximately what the EPA is asking other utilities around the country to do. So don't get caught up in that rhetoric. It will happen and it can happen. And remember, for you, the implications is that reducing carbon on a grid is going to be done in 3 or 4 different general ways. Energy efficiency is going to be possibly the most effective way. Switching to renewables is going to be another, and re-engineering fossil plants is going to be a third, and there'll be more. But that part will be, and there's a political war going on right now over the EPA. I mean, there's going to be a lot of lawsuits. There's going to be a lot of politics on the front end of this. And I would advise you that although it may not seem that critical to your business now, your advocacy on that will be very self-beneficial as well as to society.
So I think that you all talked about reliability. One of the things I'd like to talk about, though, is the this idea that by sort of busting up the utility paradigm, that we're going to be letting ourselves out of what has been a very effective way of doing environmental protection as well. We have found it much more difficult to regulate dispersed sources like transportation and so forth for environmental goals than we have to regulate the utility industry. Let me put this another way. What do you think the sort of big policy change that we're going to need is once we go with this new utility model? What is the way that we're going to have to change the way we do environmental regulation once we go with this new utility model? What's the thing that we're going to read in the paper and we're going to be like, oh, well, we're going with it?
So there is something I think is really exciting that shows you how much of a nerd I am. In the conversations leading up to Paris for the next round of global climate change framework discussions, it's some very smart people are doing it, so they caught my attention. And when I read the ideas, it's really, really compelling. They're suggesting that an alternative to the traditional top-down set a number and then force the countries to comply, they're saying what we could do on a global basis is actually tell all the countries that they must set their standard from the bottom up and then then figure out how they're going to achieve their goal of climate reductions. It's just a difference. It's a difference in framing, and I think it's apropos to here. Yes, you're right. It really would be easy if the Public Utility Commission chair and the Environmental Protection Agency chair could sit down and say, what number do we want to do, and try to force it down. That will spawn decades of lawsuits. It will waste a lot of money, and we will end up in the end with a politically negotiated compromise. But I think that one of the sort of really cool potential benefits of this two-way grid and this empowered distribution end is that communities will be able to express their preference, and even individuals. I mean, they're talking about this in Vermont, the idea that we reframe the obligation of the electric service provider to be something in the equivalent of, it's your job to help that customer achieve their carbon goals. And if you could imagine that bubbling up and communities getting together, maybe it's naive and idealistic, but I really like the idea of everybody sort of getting together and say, we want to try to be carbon free. And the choice now is not, for example, that you have to pursue, we were talking at breakfast, municipalization like Boulder and Santa Fe and those places, but you actually will have a powerful partner who runs the grid and can make sure the lights don't go off while you're doing that. And they can make enough money to suit their shareholders by providing you the value-added services that are based on what you really want. So I think there's hope in the bottoms-up strategy, even in the electric utility sector, and it may supplant that top-down thing that we'll have to give up.
Carter, I think you're correct that we may make it harder to do certain bits of enforcement by, if you will, distributing the responsibility out. One area where this comes up frequently is in demand response, where you have companies who are going to, from my understanding of your business, perhaps your clients, and saying, look, if you reduce peak demand during these hours, you'll get this much back, and we got this little diesel generator here which will take care of you just fine during that period, so you'll have your own power. Well, what's happened? You just switched from natural gas being burned on the utility grid to diesel being burned on a much less efficient engine on the distributed end. There's been no environmental gain. In fact, environmental loss. You simply redistributed the economics, and it looks cheaper to the customer. Well, it is cheaper to the customer, but only because of inefficiencies in the pricing. So you're correct. So how do you get at something like that? Well, from firsthand experience in Colorado and Internoc, we actually ordered the utility to go out and get third-party provision of demand response. Internoc showed up, and we said, no diesels. That's just our requirement from the regulatory end. Now, that's another thing that the regulator had to do, and you can multiply that many times and say, yes, we're going to do that. I guess I'm not hopeless. I'm not without hope that we can keep the environmental standards up, but as the EPA regulation is showing, you've got to let some things slide because there are just too many of them to regulate directly under Clean Air Act. It will raise the challenge, but I guess I'm convinced it will get the vast majority. And I don't see, at least on the emissions side, besides sort of large inefficient CHP systems, combined heat and power systems, which probably you can reach with regulation, the kind I just described from Colorado, I don't see a threat, certainly not from hybrid automobiles or anything like that. They're going to be cleaner than what they're replacing. So I think we're on the right trajectory. That's the best I can come up with.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually extend on that, and this is sort of in the scenarios of future possibilities, one that is hopefully a lower probability, but everybody talks about solar plus storage, right? Everybody's going to have a solar panel on their house and a battery in their basement. And when you actually get into the engineering and math on these things, you realize that you have to dramatically oversize both of those things to get to a point where it becomes remotely feasible. What is far more economically feasible is just to put in a diesel generator with your solar panels. And if you imagine a scenario where there was sort of mass grid defection of people just coupling solar panels with diesel generators, you have now literally thousands of little Honda diesel-fired generators in people's homes that are completely unregulated. And I mean, I don't think about the probability of that as being pretty low, but it's just a scenario I could imagine.
You could argue, though, I mean, the median peaker here in ISO New England runs 2% of the time. So you could argue that there's massive overinvestment happening already. that this kind of stuff could actually help solve storage plus other kinds of things. So what about the transmission side of things? We started out by talking to the grid, and I promise this is the last sort of thing I'm worried about that we're going to talk about, because I'm going to end on a positive note. But let's talk about transmission investment. The Edison Electric Institute came out with a study, I think it was in 2013, they called Challenges, And they're concerned about this sort of dwindling customer base, not rate base, customer base, dwindling customer base at the same time that we're adding electric cars and we're adding load and our electric use is growing, so that you've got this sort of transmission investment gap developing. That's another thing that was brought up as a worry here. How do we manage that transition?
Well, it is the case that electric utilities, as a group across the country, are being asked to invest will invest a lot of money in the next 20 years. And the question is, what kind of business activities is going to pay for that? I believe there will be a substantial amount of, I won't call it grid defection, but a substantial amount of distributed generation, mainly from distributed solar. But there are limits to that. There are real limits to that. A lot of houses, probably 2/3 of them, aren't suitable. Residential load is only 30% of total load, so if you imagine half of that going to solar, well, a third of that going to solar, that reduces the utilities' total sales by less than 10%. So you have to sort of get real about the size of these things. That's one point. The other point is, if utilities get smarter, and I mean by that, if they are induced to act smart by regulators, you'll begin to see much more use of demand response to balance the loads in the market. And that will obviate the need for a lot of storage, for starters. I'm unconvinced at this point of the general economics of storage. You're nodding yes over here. I think you were not?
No, I don't.
Oh, I thought you were agreeing with, oh. So I'm unconvinced of the economics of massive deployment of distributed storage. I mean, it's a kind of thing where if you don't really look at the numbers, it's kind of a plausible case. It sounds about right. But when you start doing the economics, as you just said, you will find there will be lots of overcapacity involved in that. So I think we're going to see the response to much of the, let's just call it the distributed function. I think we're going to see a lot of that responded to by the utility through demand response. And it won't be, I mean, that evokes certain things. Stop thinking of all the channels that you think of with demand response and start thinking of a organic grid which sort of inhales and exhales as it needs to. That's what it's really going to look like.
For me, what it comes down to is right now we know the table is tilted to favor those big investments. The whole regulatory model encourages utilities to do it. It gives them return on it. They're looking at it with a increasingly competitive wholesale sector as a place where they can actually get iron in the ground and get rate of return and on invested capital. So there's a strong dynamic there, and it's too far over to that side, right? We need a revealed price at the distribution edge that includes the true stack of avoided costs going all the way up, so that we can theoretically optimize. I think Ron is exactly right. I mean, you think about that Better Place business model, where they said, oh, we're going to have these electric vehicles, we're going to have batteries, so you can just drop the battery out and replace it with another battery. So the battery in a freaking car is already only used 5% of the time to move 5% of the mass, the human body. The rest is to move the car. It's a grossly inefficient way to do things. And now the solution to storage is that we're going to have a spare battery that's only needed even less than that amount of time. Where's the business model in that asset utilization rate? We've got so much opportunity to tackle. Everybody's seen the asset utilization curves of the distribution system and those couple hundred hours that make up peak demand. There's huge value to be mined there with distributed stuff, and you still want to get the electricity coming through. We're just trying to flatten it right now, and we need to tilt the system back toward where that becomes exciting and inspiring and inviting to this new range of technologies that we started this conversation talking about?
So to your original question about the fear of the transmission investments and all that from EVs and things, I think it's all BS. I mean, I think it's just it's something that this is the only industry that gets scared of the potential for new revenue. And we don't, I mean, it's just, I look at it like you just have to, I mean, you can, if you have, just get a little creativity and you will solve this problem. It's not that hard. And you're going to have to do things that you're not historically comfortable because, you know, they're scared because the only thing they know is just to keep building more stuff, and that's not what you have to do. Regarding storage and my confusing response to Ron, I guess my feeling on storage is that we actually are finding places where it is economic, and when you start to stack the values, and it's typically in a place where you're avoiding some other transmission or distribution investment where it's the better thing to put there. And I agree that I struggle with storage in the home. And people think of it as the holy grail, but honestly, when you really look at it, it just becomes very hard to justify economically, and even for just a consumer. I mean, I can get my electricity right now, you know, hassle-free, and now you want me to put an appliance in my home that will probably die in 10 years, and I got to replace it again, and it's just there's so much stacked against it.
So I wanna start a Nessie building energy tradition here. This is going to be year one for this. Can you tell me how many of you have done any work for any customer who was entirely off the grid? Can somebody take a count? Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's quite a few, actually. This is they're all in Western Mass, aren't they? So I want to challenge Jennifer to come back, do this every 5 years. Come back and take I have a friend who's an energy economist who he just does what. Oh, I got another question for you. How many people here don't have a landline in their home? How many people here have not had a landline in their home for more than 5 years? How many for more than 10 years? Wow. So that was pretty fast, wasn't it? I think that this will be a fun thing to do. Every 5 years we'll come back and we're going to find out how many of you have worked for customers who've said, you know what, just keep your wires.
How many of you wear tinfoil hats? No, never mind. I'm not even asking about the guys growing weed. Okay, so.
I want to thank you. You guys are just amazing. And I also want to thank the inimitable Fred Unger for putting together this panel for us. It was just amazing. Thank you.
Actually, you've been a very polite audience. Thank you.